COP26 Climate Change Conference taking place in Glasgow is promising to unveil its visions of a global net zero future. However, there are at least 7 fundamental flaws in this intention. We go through them one by one. China, India and Russia have no intention of slowing down their economic growth. Half the coal burned in the world is burned in China, and it continues to add many new coal power plants within China with a lifespan of 40 to 50 years. India is the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases and is dependent on coal and oil. India's energy demand is expected to rise sharply over the next decade. It has rejected the net zero target. Russia has an enormous investment in natural fossil gas and now has the Nord Stream 2 pipeline up and running. Any reduction in the use of gas throughout Europe would not be viewed favourably by Russia. Putin and Xi will not attend COP26. Developing nations are the 2nd largest emitters of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. They produce 23% of total global emissions. But they do not have strong enough economies to implement the demands of net zero. The well-paid bureaucrats of the United Nations believe this problem can be fixed if we, so-called richer nations, contribute at least $100 billion annually to the developing nations. The naivety of this proposal is quite staggering. How much will go into the pockets of corrupt governments and how much into net zero can be left to the imagination. This policy will undoubtedly trigger urgent demands for funds from many developing nations looking to exploit the stupidity of the West. Nations often make commitments in principle but then compromise their actions when their individual nation is adversely affected. The UK's October 2021 budget ignores the requirements of the Paris Agreement and encourages the consumption of fossil fuels when it makes internal flights cheaper and puts a freeze on fuel duty. In Germany, the SPD party proposes that the role of gas in the energy transition should be reflected in the EU's green finance taxonomy. This is a politician's way of saying we need to carry on using the fossil fuel gas because it suits our national economy. The true cost of net zero is unknown, and no concrete, viable plan exists for its implementation. This is a way of saying that the entire concept has been dreamed up by a collection of bureaucrats that have no practical experience of implementing anything other than the endless production of reports. The United Nations bureaucrats have utterly failed in their prime objective, which is to maintain international peace and security, as this list clearly shows. But it is these same ineffectual bureaucrats that now have an annual budget of $3.2 billion. They have churned out endless reports from 1992 onwards. With the end result being that the original Paris Agreement targets are already out of date. You will note the UN's implication that this is the fault of individual governments. Not at all. This actually means that the original Paris Agreement targets were entirely unrealistic, were not achievable, and had no realistic, viable plan in place that could achieve those targets. This is not the fault of nations failing to meet the targets. It is the fault of the Paris Agreement authors who, while sitting at their desks remote from the real world, had set unachievable targets. These people are simply incompetent. They do not have a viable plan, and without a viable plan, there cannot be a viable estimate of costs. But they will be attending COP26. Much of what we have said of the United Nations can be said of the World Economic Forum and its founder, Klaus Schwab. These people are academics and bureaucrats that have achieved nothing other than organising meetings, producing reports, and the occasional co-authored book. They are, in practical terms, incompetent and have no viable plan for the Great Reset. And to repeat, without a viable plan, there cannot be a viable estimate of costs. Can you imagine running a business in such a manner? Quite simply, there is no business case for the Paris Agreement and net zero. Ask simple questions such as, how many electric charging points will be required in, say, 2025, and where will they be located? There are thousands of similar questions to ask, and none have an answer. The UK is leading COP26 and will be strongly backed by Australia, Canada, France, Italy and Germany. There would be an enormous impact to these countries attempting to implement a net zero strategy. What would be the benefit? This is the share of carbon dioxide emissions by country. China, the developing nations, United States, India and Russia account for 76% of all emissions. These 6 countries account for only 8% of global emissions. Thus, if the UK, Australia, Canada, France, Italy and Germany were to achieve net zero by 2030 or whenever, it would have a negligible effect on global carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration. But the costs to each country would be enormous. A stable climate and environment has never existed. But the claim that such a climate and environment did exist and should be regarded as normal is a premise upon which the Paris Agreement and net zero are built. This fabled time does not appear if we look at global mean annual temperatures from 500 million years ago to approximately the 20th century. Neither does it appear over the past 800,000 years. And going into closer detail, no such stable climate can be identified over the past 12,000 years. We need to absorb the fact that we live in the coldest period of the last 10,000 years, and the IPCC's reference period from which it measures climate change, around 1875, is the lowest point of the last 8,000 years. This same fundamental claim of the Paris Agreement proponents that the climate has been stable over the course of human history, and now, all of a sudden, that's not the case anymore. This is staggeringly ignorant of the facts, or it is a deliberate lie. The most fundamental driving force behind a net zero policy is the hypothesis that increased carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration necessarily causes increased GMST. This hypothesis is entirely unproven and has been contradicted numerous times in the historical records. Take the period 4800 BCE to 1500 CE. Carbon dioxide concentration increased from 258 parts per million to 282 parts per million, while global average temperature fell by around 0.7 degrees Celsius. This was over a period of 6,300 years. The hypothesis was invalidated over that entire period. Moving from the past right up to the present day, over the past 7 years, carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration has steadily increased. But over the same 7 years, the trend of global average temperature is a decrease at the rate of 0.84 degrees Celsius per century. The COP26 conference has started, and we must now conclude. Despite the imminent disaster facing the world, it is uplifting to see our leaders relaxing and enjoying themselves without a care in the world. With only Justin Trudeau spoiling the jollity by insisting on wearing a mask, and the Prime Minister of India also dampened the mood a little when he announced that India will target net zero carbon emissions by 2070, 2 decades later than the targets for the conference, and 50 years from now. Based on the flaws discussed in this video, it would be easy to just dismiss the threat of the Paris Agreement and net zero. But the immature and incompetent attempts to implement the Paris Agreement could, and almost certainly will, have a catastrophic impact on the West, which is why these leaders are smiling and why we must resist all attempts to implement the immature and dangerously unscientific aims of the Paris Agreement. If you would like to join our community, you can discover us by searching the locals.com website, or go directly through opposingtheparisagreement.locals.com.